Hello and welcome to the Ground Jewels. My name is James Dixon. I'm delighted that you've joined us again this week. This week we have a fantastic guest. Uli Hesse is a German football author and a fantastic stadium, one which I know many people have on their bucket list to visit. It's the Westfalenstadion in Dortmund, home of Borussia Dortmund, home of the Yellow Wall, one of the great European football stadiums. Iconic, really. And this year they are celebrating their 50th anniversary of the Westfalenstadion. It was built, as you'll hear from the interview, just before the 1974 World Cup, which West Germany hosted. And Uli is a lifelong Dortmund fan who was born in Dortmund, grew up within half an hour of the stadium. He's a celebrated author. He's written books on Dortmund, on Franz Beckenbauer, and possibly most famously, he wrote the book Tor, the story of German football. Really one of the great football books of the 21st century. So he was very kind to join us and spend time talking about his memories of the stadium and the fascinating details. We're covering a period from 1977, which was when he first went, up until modern day. We talk about the Hitzfeld era. We talk about Jurgen Klopp. We talk about commercialism, fan culture, everything in there, football tourism, hipsters, etc. There's a lot in there, and it's a really great interview, and we'll get to that in a second. Regular listeners will know we do a little bit of stadium news, and it's in my parish this week because Birmingham City have announced plans for a 60,000-seater stadium to replace St Andrews. Now, St Andrews has been around since 1906. It's in not the best condition, as people will have seen from a couple of seasons ago, or last season. I'm confused. But when half the ground was closed because it didn't pass its safety inspection. So yeah, I don't think anyone disputes that either St Andrews needs a big renovation or perhaps we need a new ground. When we're sitting in the relegation places as of time of recording, and potentially going down to League One, to the third division for the first time since the early 90s, 60,000 seems quite optimistic. We've survived a number of times before in this championship run. We've sort of scratched around, so who knows? Maybe we'll be able to get a result against Coventry or Rotherham or Huddersfield or Norwich. Those are our last four games. But as it stands, Birmingham City would be playing League One football next season, and the plan is for us to have a 60,000-seater stadium within 5 years. I mean, love the ambition, guys. But can we get it right on the pitch? I don't know. We will see. But that's our stadium news for this week, and we are going to go straight to our interview with the brilliant author Uli Hesse. Today we're joined by Uli Hesse, a German football author who has written numerous brilliant books, including Tor, the story of German football, The Three Lives of the Kaiser, a biography of Franz Beckenbauer, and Building the Yellow Wall, the incredible rise and cult appeal of Borussia Dortmund. Uli, welcome to the Ground Jewels.
James, it's my pleasure. Hello.
Thank you very much. And it's for your expertise on Dortmund that we've asked you on this podcast. The Westfalenstadion is 50 years old this year, and it will be one of the featured venues when Germany hosts Euro 2024 later this summer. But Dortmund's only Germany's 9th largest city, but the stadium has a capacity of over 81,000, and it's Germany's biggest stadium. And the South Terrace, or the Sud Tribune, is nicknamed the Yellow Wall, and it's famous for generating
intense atmospheres. Can you describe the Yellow Wall for someone who's never experienced it?
Oh wow, that's a tough one to start the podcast with, because maybe I should start by saying that I literally grew up there. I mean, there are some authors' biographies which are floating around about me, which say that I was born in Dortmund. And that's true, but I didn't grow up here. I grew up 30 minutes down the road, which is not far, but if you're a kid, it is far. So I only saw my first game when I was 11. Actually, it was shortly before my 11th birthday in 1977. And it just recently occurred to me that the ground was only 3 years old at that time. So I've actually grown up with the ground, and I've grown up, pretty much in the ground, at the ground, because I've been a season ticket holder since 1982. I've, even though I'm a professional writer, I almost never go to the press stand. I always stand on the terraces. So it's really difficult. I mean, in a way, it's easy for me to describe everything, but it's also very hard for me to say, in just a couple of lines, what the Yellow Wall is or what it means. Maybe I can say that one of the greatest things about the ground and the stand for me is that, and I think that maybe some people aren't quite aware of this, is that the lower part of the terrace, I mean, when you look at it today, it looks like one huge terrace. And that's not quite true. It's actually two terraces. Because the older, lower one is exactly the way it was when I first went there in 1977. I mean, exactly. The stairs are the same. The railings are the same. The crush barriers are the same. Nothing has changed. There was a time when we had to, switch to all-seater for European games. And they did that by bringing in removable seats. And after the game, they brought them out again. So this stand. And then they added a second tier in the 1990s. And this one is a bit different because at that time they knew, they installed seats and everything, those fold-up chairs, because they knew they would need them for European games. So there is the old part and the new part. And like I said, for me, the greatest thing is really that it's the lower part is virtually unchanged. It's like whenever I go there, it's a bit like time traveling.
That must be wonderful to sort of have an incredibly modern stadium, but also a time capsule to your youth as well. So I understand that you've got the old stadium, the original stadium, right next door, so you can literally see your past.
I mean, you're always attached to your team, of course. You're always attached to your ground, but I do think it's something very, very special. That for one, we've not built one of those modern grounds, outside of the city. Right now in the Bundesliga, there's a couple of teams. I don't want to mention names that that have built new grounds outside at the highway. So we've never done that. And it's also that, as you said, the ground that we used before this one was built for the 1970 World Cup is still right next to it. And my brother is 12 years older than I am. And he first went to the old ground. He started going in the 60s. And the craziest thing is that they rebuilt the old ground a few times. They added wooden tiers. They added a wooden stand, to accommodate more people. But it's all being built back now into its original state. So you can go to the old ground and it looks exactly like it would look in the mid-60s. The stairs are still the same, and I assume the crush barriers are still the same. And then you have the new ground, which is this behemoth, which towers above the old ground. But it's still got many parts of it that are still as they used to be in 1974, as I said.
Wonderful, wonderful character. And I guess the story of this stadium begins with that 1974 World Cup. if I'm correct, Dortmund's originally not scheduled to be a host of the World Cup, but there's Cologne doesn't put up the money or doesn't refurbish their stadium, and an opportunity arises for Dortmund to be a host of the 74 World Cup, and that's how the ground begins. But it's kind of interesting to me because at the time you've got two new stadia being built for that World Cup, or technically not that World Cup, but being built in the 70s in Germany. One, which is the Westfalenstadion, which begins as a sort of, I guess, kind of classic sort of four separate stands. It's very boxy. It almost looks like a football stadium you would get in Sabutio when it begins. And the other one, which is down there in Bavaria, which is this incredibly futuristic sort of design for originally for the Olympics, but also with the 74 World Cup in mind. It's quite a contrast, isn't it, between what's being built in Dortmund and what's being built in Munich at the time.
Yeah, I mean, not just Munich. It's been often remarked upon that. The most outstanding feature of the ground is that it's a pure football ground, just as you said, which has become normal again, because a lot of clubs now want to move back into football-only grounds. But of course, that was not at all the zeitgeist in the 70s and 80s. Just remember all those awful grounds they built for Italia 1990. Huge things with running tracks and everything. But that's what people wanted back then. And it's precisely what you said, that Dortmund were not meant to be a host city in 74. Of course, the FIFA, they have all sorts of regulations for World Cup grounds, the size and the seated areas and how many seats and so on. And Cologne had a problem. I think it was mainly a time problem. And so Dortmund stepped in. But there was not much time left. And the reason Dortmund were not supposed to be a host city is that the team was in the second division at the time. It seemed kind of silly to build a huge new ground for a second division team. Also, the city didn't have any money, so there were funds available, but not a lot. So, and all these things combined, just time pressure, and we need another ground, and we have to build it quickly. Just is why we arrived at this ground, which did not. Well, it didn't meet all of the regulations. For instance, there was too much terracing, but it was just a time problem. So everybody agreed and said, "Let's go on. Let's play there." For instance, our dear neighbors and fierce rivals, Schalke, they got their own ground for the World Cup, and it's one of those huge things. The Parkstadion. It was just god awful. I mean, they grew to love it, as you would grow to love your own ground. But everybody I ever met who went there as an away fan just hated it, because it was large, it was spacious, there was these running tracks, you couldn't properly see the players. You'd always get wet, because let's not forget that, which is also a feature of the Olympic Stadium in Munich, that it's got this futuristic roof, but there's no roof for anybody else. Whereas Dortmund had, which was also a defining feature from the beginning, that everybody said, well, I mean, listening to this in 2024 will seem silly for a football fan, but back then people actually said, hey, we've got a roof above our heads, which is not the norm, for a football fan. So, which was another reason why people loved the ground.
It's strange that in the past, and it's universal, whether it's Germany, England, or elsewhere, these things to make the fans comfortable were seen as sort of weird and unusual and optional.
But it holds all true for the players, because I saw my first game, as I said, in January 1977, and there's footage from that game. I can see highlights from that game, and the state of the pitch is unbelievable. They would never kick off a game under these conditions today. It was literally a mud bath. But back then, they didn't care. They just played.
So that's in the 76-77 season. That's Dortmund's first season back in the Bundesliga after promotion in 76. Yeah. Is it against Karlsruhe, the first game that you went to?
How did you know that? Did I?
I've done my research on you. You've mentioned it on another podcast, and so I picked that up. I haven't been following you since before I was born, so don't worry about that. But yeah, so you're playing Karlsruhe. What do you remember about that game? That sort of first experience? How do even if it's the walk to the stadium or anything like that? Does anything stick out?
Yeah, it's funny because you said the ground turns 50 this year, so there are going to be all kinds of celebrations and everything, and the club are issuing they have a members magazine that goes out to all the members, and they're going to devote an issue to the 50th anniversary of the ground, and they asked me to write something about it, and I did it together with a friend of mine. And at one point in his piece, so we exchanged notes and everything. And at one point in the piece, he went on about the atmosphere of the ground, and in the stands. And then he said something like most fans don't even remember exactly, the date and the game and the name of the opposition of the first game. They only remember the atmosphere. And I immediately crossed that out, put it, because I remember quite a lot. And of course, I know the date of my first game, and I know who we played. So I may be an exception, but I don't think so. Anyway, maybe it's just because, I'm a professional writer these days and I look these things up. But yeah, I remember this very vividly. The funny thing about the game is, actually, there's two funny things. The first is that you would normally expect my brother to take me because, like I said, he's 12 years older than I am. And he was one of the original members of the first Dortmund fan club. And he was one of those guys who traveled around in the second division, when, just a handful of people would, follow the team away. So of course I became a Dortmund fan because of my brother. And I mean, you would probably expect him to take me to the game, but he didn't. Actually, I've never asked him why, but I have an idea, of course. I mean, if you're one of the committed fans on the South Stand, you don't want to take your 10-year-old kid brother to the game. So it was my sister who took me. And we also mentioned this. Well, I'm digressing here. Anyway, so she took me. And of course, she was almost as excited as I was because somehow she got it into her head that I would be disappointed, that I was expecting too much. So all the way to the game, she kept telling me that, live football is not like football on television. And she kept repeating that, there are games where nobody scores, games finish 0-0. It could happen that there's, no goal mouth action, whatever. Games can be very, very boring. So the funny thing is that, of course, we went to the South Stand. I don't know why. I mean, today you would probably take a 10-year-old and sit down with him, right? But we went to the terraces, so I needed a small fold-up chair to stand on, because otherwise you can't see as a kid on the terraces. And there were goals by the truckload, I mean, there was a goal literally every 5 minutes. Dortmund scored 7 times, and it was, it was fantastic.
It's not a bad start, is it? 7 goals in your first home game. But I guess that possibly was a bit of a false dawn because the 70s and most of the 80s weren't necessarily a golden period for Dortmund. You win a German Cup, your first German Cup in 1989. And then I think certainly by the looks of the fortunes of the team sort of turn around in 1991 when Ottmar Hitzfeld is appointed, and you go on to have almost win the Bundesliga in 92, finish runners-up in the UEFA Cup in 93, and in 1993 as well, you perhaps even more importantly acquire Matthias Sammer from Inter Milan, and he becomes the foundation of your sort of golden period and the side that would eventually go on to win the Champions League.
I think the fortunes turned a bit before Ottmar Hitzfeld. Of course, he was a key figure, but it was really, for most Dortmund fans of my generation, it was really that cup win in '89. There was sort of the end of the dark ages, because as you said, it's also there there's also a bit of a misconception these days that people will tell you that the ground was always full and the terrace was always full, but it wasn't quite the case, because most of the 80s were really tough. It was you had, as everywhere else, you had the hooligan element. In Dortmund, it was coupled with we were suddenly fighting relegation every season, and it all became a bit drab. So just recently, I was telling a friend of mine that when I traveled to the '89 Cup final, they used to sing 40,000 at traveling to Berlin, and it's true there were 40,000 Dortmund away fans, So the Autobahn was full of Dortmund fans, but it didn't really register with me until we actually went into the ground, and I saw all these Dortmund fans singing and waving flags, and suddenly it occurred to me that we could actually win the game, Until that point, despite winning the quarterfinals, the semifinals, despite buying tickets and traveling all that way to Berlin, I had never actually thought we could actually win this because, that had not been part of my DNA as a fan. My brother was different, he knew the golden era in the 60s, and he was young enough to remember when they won the Cup Winners' Cup. But for me, I'd grown up with Dortmund being, a promoted team and then fighting relegation. So I never thought we could actually win it. So that was, despite it being a fantastic day and a great game, there was also sort of a, how would you say, mind changer for me.
I'm trying to think what the English idiom sort of be for that is sort of we would possibly say it changed your perspective. I now want to change the entire premise of this podcast and talk to you about what West Berlin was like in 1989, because that's got to be quite an adventure.
Yeah, it's also because the cup final was very late that year. It was in June, so we were literally only a few months away from the wall coming down, but there were no indications whatsoever. We were queuing for literally hours at the border, and it was bizarre. It was again, for somebody listening to this in 2024, it will seem very strange as it seemed at the time, though we'd gotten quite used to it, if you know what I mean. So looking back on it now, of course, you leave your country, you travel through a foreign country, which is actually your own country, but not really. And then you enter a city surrounded by a wall to play a cup final there is pretty bizarre, but that's what it was. That's what it was like in the 80s.
Triumph of symbolism, really, in one way, in terms of the maintaining of the cup final in West Berlin and the Olympiastadion there.
Yeah, it was moved in the mid 80s. It was there was no fixed venue until the mid 80s when they decided for political reasons to give it to what was then West Berlin.
Obviously, in your perspective, there, is really helpful and much more accurate than mine in terms of the sort of turnaround of the team. And I kind of get the impression that the success that the team went on to have, which was back-to-back Bundesligas, back-to-back German Cups, and as we said, the 97 Champions League, sort of creates the impetus to develop the ground. Because there is more money perhaps at the club and perhaps more people wanting to go? Or is it just sort of also caught up in that sort of 90s wave of football and commercialism where things like where the stadium developments are happening?
Yeah, now that you put it like this, it might have been a bit of both. Because, it's true that our club, in the second half of the 90s and at the turn of the century, they did become megalomaniac, they, sorry. To me, the perfect example is just at one point, they must have walked around those sports shows, and looked at the replica shirts and looked at the price tag. And somebody must have said €100, how much of this are Nike getting, why can't we produce these ourselves? So what they did was they actually canceled a lucrative contract with Nike and started their own sporting apparel company from scratch, just because they thought, we're Dortmund, we can do this. So yeah, maybe there was a bit of, we have to, stadium develop thing. But it's also true that I was just, just the other day I was talking about this because during the Eindhoven game in the Champions League, we were talking about when it got really, really crowded on the South Stand. For instance, what they do these days is you have on your ticket, there is a number for a certain block, on the stand. And these days they will make sure that, they check your ticket, not just at the turnstiles, but also as you enter the block. That's because a lot of people, as hard as it may seem to believe, a lot of people are trying to get tickets for the seated areas and then try to get onto the terrace. And so, and there have been some nasty incidents just because it was too crowded, And we were thinking back to when it got really, really crowded, and that was really the early to mid 1990s. It was just this combination of football suddenly becoming very hip. Football had a bad name in the 80s, not just in England, but also in Germany. Then it was Dortmund just being very, very good, probably the most exciting team in the league. It was this football-only ground. And it was also the rise of Italian-style support, Not yet the ultras, they came a bit later, but the mid-90s was when the Bengal lights came in, and people would suddenly start flares and everything. And looking back on it, it was a bit dangerous, actually, but back then we didn't think twice about it. It was just exciting. So that's when it got really, really full. And I realized this in a very, people can be stupid, can't they? It was, you mentioned this near championship, which when we almost won the league.
Oh, it's one of the great stories, and if you can see the look on players' faces, thinking because I covered it for my book, but from the winner's perspective, because Stuttgart are obviously come out of that really well.
Yeah, you're right. It's one of the great stories. I mean, normally when people tell it, they sadly forget Eintracht Frankfurt, because they were the team that should have won it, and they went into last match day, and it was theirs to win or lose, and they will tell you to this day that they were robbed by diabolical refereeing. But suddenly it was down to two unfancy teams, Stuttgart and Dortmund, and this got nothing to do with the ground because we were playing away in Duisburg. But it was the last day ever that I brought a radio with me to a football game, because of course we started celebrating 30 minutes from time. And then I remember this very vividly, that 4 minutes from time, suddenly all the flags came down on the stand opposite ours. And everybody turned towards me and said, "What happened?" So I was the one who had to tell them that, I think Stuttgart have scored a goal. So that was, in hindsight, of course, it was a blessing in disguise for Dortmund, because we played the UEFA Cup, we earned a lot of money, and I learned a lesson because I broke a foot. So I broke my foot. So I had it in plaster and I had crutches. And we were playing Roma in the UEFA Cup. It was the home game against Roma. And I thought, I can stand on the terrace with, what's the problem with crutches? And I realized that it was not the best of ideas because I had to climb up all those stairs, I don't even remember how I got there. I think my wife she dropped me off. And then when I saw all those stairs, I thought, this is going to be a bit tougher than I thought, And then I was there quite early because I had those crutches. But then it got really, really, really crowded. And it can become a bit dangerous at the best of times. But when you're on crutches, let me tell you, it's not a good idea. And I think it was even during the first half that I had to turn around. I could no longer face the ground like this. So just to balance myself on the crutches, I was watching the game like this, over my shoulder. And of course, we scored the winning goal. And it was lost my balance. I fell, and somebody picked me up, and all those things. But that was when I thought, oh God, this is really getting crowded, and we're becoming really, really popular.
I'm not sure going to one of Europe's biggest terraces on crutches is a good idea.
It would have been half sensible 5 years earlier, maybe, but at that time, yeah.
So there's this huge, as you say, rise for various factors, and the club is becoming, in your words from your book, it's sort of becoming a bit of a cult. One of the things that British fans look enviously on often is German football culture or German fan culture. It's very regularly remarked upon that we wish that our clubs were a little bit more like German clubs in terms of ownership models and fan engagement and things like that. When did that start coming into Dortmund, and what effect did that have on the stadium and the stadium experience as a fan?
I may have said this on a podcast before, but it may be the strangest development in my lifetime as a football fan. That when I grew up, we all wanted to be like the English, and suddenly the English wanted to be like us. This was very strange, but of course it happened. I mean, I think the key contributing factor was probably the Taylor Report and everything that happened after it in England, and how German fans reacted. I mean, I did a book about Dortmund, not the English book, but I did an oral history book, just talking to Dortmund fans. And because when the Taylor Report came in, and when it was when the idea was floated about that the grounds would be turned into all-seater stadium, the club later on were telling us that they've already thought of, turning the terrace into all-seated areas. They'd always wanted to preserve the terraces. But that's not how we remember it. And that's not how the people in my book remember it, Many fans I talked to said there were heated debates and discussions with the club about what to do. And so there was a chance, however slight it might have been, I don't know, there was a chance that the ground would have become an all-seater ground in the early 90s. And that would have changed a lot, of course. But it didn't. And it didn't largely because the fans didn't want that. I've also said it on numerous occasions, we all understand why the English couldn't do this. After Heysel and Hillsborough, nobody could stand up and say, doing away with terracing is taking things too far. It was just, but we never had a major stadium disaster like that. So we didn't have this emotional baggage. So here the fans just said, no, we want to have terraces, we want to have standing areas, cheap tickets and everything. And they had demonstrations and everything. And so that's why the German FA won an exemption from UEFA's all-seater rule, for the Bundesliga. And I think that was really the start of, which years later down the road led to this bizarre situations that, people would come over from England to watch their football in Germany because we do have a lot of fan power. Here in Germany, the fans are always saying, the clubs are crazy and it's getting commercialized and nobody's listening to us. But of course, compared to everywhere else, they do have a lot of impact and influence,
Oh, yeah.
As it just recently, all those fan protests have led to the league changing their stance on bringing an investor in, which this would have been unthinkable in any other country, I think, any other bigger footballing country.
Oh yeah, you see, we've got clubs that are state owned, but in terms of I know the recent 50+1 protests were eventually sort of successful, but it's the cultures between the two countries are vast. I actually there's not personally, but I knew of fans who would say that it was cheaper for them to fly to Germany and have a Bayern season ticket or a Dortmund season ticket than have an Arsenal season ticket. Because of cheap flights and Ryanair and how competitive your ticket prices were. So, yeah, it's interesting. But I suppose a little bit of that sort of football tourism, because they're coming for this great experience, this authentic experience of of Dortmund or wherever it is. But the more football tourists there are, it dilutes that experience and actually undermines what they're seeking in the first place.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not just the hipsters. It's also success can do this to you. You started out by asking me about the South Stand, the terrace, and I told you about how there's an old part and a new part, and just you asked about the rebuilding of the ground in the mid-90s, which was in fact mainly down in part because the club were becoming too big for themselves, but it was mainly down. There was just too much demand. The ground was sold out all the time. The South Stand was really, really, really crowded, and the club were trying to address that problem. As far as I remember, moving to someplace else was never discussed. Building an entirely new ground was never really discussed. So they just, they rebuilt it completely, they added second tiers, but it's really a major rebuilding. And this caused the problem. Because you would think like there's 12,500 people on the South Stand and they make an awful lot of noise. And you think, hey, you double that, you've got 25,000. They're going to make double the noise, but that's not how it works. Number one is too many people came in who were not into making noises. There was long before people from England came over. There was a lot of people were just, they were glory hunters probably. And it's also because, at least that's the major theory we have, that the small compact stand and the roof, it just collect this noise and they just threw it out onto the pitch. But the ground, when it became really spacious, it was really difficult, and that's so in the second half of the 90s, there was really, really a terrible drop down in atmosphere, combination of all things. Most people blame the glory hunters and they blame the terrace that's too big. But there is also the fact that people became a bit complacent, which is totally unlike Dortmund. But we became somehow the how do I put this? The attitude of the people who ran the club, they were somehow reflected by the fans. We suddenly had the attitude like we're just on the same level as Bayern Munich. We're one of the really big teams in Europe. And we're going to rule the world. And then we went public, which is a major story of the club. That we became. You just mentioned the word authentic. We hear this often from non-Germans. That Dortmund still feel like an authentic club. But within Germany, we often hear this. Dortmund fans are at the forefront of doing all these protests. They're all very active in these protests against commercialization and everything. And within Germany, we often hear people will often say, well, why are you guys so against it? You went public, You're the only club that's floating shares on the stock market. To which we always reply, oh, that's why. That's exactly why. Because there were some warning words when we went public, but nobody really listened. It was most people were just awash in glory and thinking, give us another 500 million euros. We're going to buy another Matthias Sammer. And most people will tell you that probably the low point of the entire ground I think it was in the second half of the 90s when they started up a chant that went like, if we want to, we can buy you up. Meaning we're so rich, we're so powerful, and we're, floating shares, and we'll just buy your club. So quite apart from the fact that it's technically not possible in Germany to buy a club, it's just, people were just, so all this combined led to a really a decline in atmosphere. And that's when the ultras came in Dortmund, because they said, we can't have this, things got back to what they were before, and we have to orchestrate support. That's what they always say, because the ground is so big. And there was, and since then it's much improved, of course. And you mentioned Ottmar Hitzfeld, but it's really the two defining features of the club as they are now are the near bankruptcy in the early noughties and Jurgen Klopp coming in and turning the club around.
And obviously, English fans are incredibly familiar with Klopp and what he's done at Liverpool, his final season at Liverpool, at Liverpool now. And what was that like? Because he's not a big name when he comes in. He sort of has a sort of journeyman career. How does he help galvanize the support and to help drive the culture? Because he seems to be one of those managers that's very big on culture, not just in terms of team, but in terms of club.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I don't know how many non-Liverpool fans will be listening to this, because the craziest thing about the guy is that he really is like this. I did an interview with him when he was fairly new to Dortmund, and we were talking about why he joined Dortmund, in the first place. And you would think, thinking back, you would think that, well, of course, Dortmund were a big club, and he came from a small club, so of course he signed. But he said, well, no, not really, because he said he had an offer from Dortmund, a contract offer, and he looked at it. And then he phoned up the club and said, listen, you are aware that what you're offering me here is not even what I'm getting at Mainz in the second division. And I said, yeah, well, we do, but we don't have any money. So it was really, at that time, Dortmund were really having a lot of problems on the field and off the field. But what appealed to him was, as you say, was the culture. Where he said that whenever he was a visiting coach with Mainz, he would stand on the pitch and just look at the stands and thinking that, well, I would love to coach here, just play football here in this place for these people. But it must be very, very exciting. And at the time, I was not entirely sure if he was being honest, If you do more than 5 interviews in your life, you come across people who are not always, honest. So I wasn't quite sure if he was really putting on the front or, which is the kind of question you often have with Klopp, is he really like that? I mean, or is he just, playing a role? And then gradually over the years, it turned out that no, he's not playing a role. This is actually what he's like and what he's interested in. And the true story. I mentioned this friend of mine with whom I did the oral history book about Borussia Dortmund. This came out in 2013, shortly before the Champions League final. And we did promotion. And we were interviewed by a magazine, but it was not in person, it was a written interview. So people send you questions and you answer them. And so my friend and I, we were given the same questions and then gave our answers. And the final question was, where will Jurgen Klopp be in 5 years? So this 2013. And my friend replies, I hope he's still in Dortmund. And if not, he will be coaching Bayern or the national team. And I wrote Liverpool. And I've been asked a couple of times since then if, did you have inside information as a journalist, But it was just, no, it was very simple. I was thinking about, if if there's where could Klopp go if he leaves Dortmund? And there aren't many clubs like that, which have this, as you say, the culture, the mystique, the aura. These things do appeal to him, and that's why I wasn't really surprised. But you're right, yeah, he just loves this atmosphere, and that's why he and Dortmund were a perfect match, just like he and Liverpool are and were a perfect match.
Yeah, it really was special for a time there. I convinced myself, because I think that Champions League final was at Wembley. I'd convinced myself you were gonna win that against Bayern. I think I bought into the mystique of Klopp actually more than the team itself. He's just a person that I feel anyway that you can root for and you can get behind, because of the passion that he shows. Has the post Klopp era been a disappointment in any way? Because you're still bringing in fantastic players. They're not staying, but I guess they never did. Lewandowski left, Haaland left, Bellingham, who originally played for my team, Birmingham City, in England. He's obviously doing fantastic at Real Madrid now. Has there been a sort of, a little dip after the Klopp era, or does it feel as good as ever?
Yeah, I mean, disappointment probably is the de facto. Is the headline probably. I mean, it sounds silly, of course. When you look at how well we're doing and how well the team is placed, qualifying for the Champions League almost automatically. I say this even knowing that's going to be close this year, but doing well in Europe, winning the cup, coming very, very close to winning the league. It's really silly to complain, especially. And I don't complain, we were talking about the 70s and 80s and 90s, and I have no complaints. But it is, of course, I was talking about this with Simon Hughes the other day, the Liverpool-based writer. We're talking about Klopp, of course, and we were talking about what it would be like at Liverpool, post-Klopp. And from a Dortmund perspective, all I can say is it's going to be a couple of very long years are ahead of them, because even if they're doing well, there will always be this. It's not like it was under Klopp, This manager is not like Klopp, He's okay, but he's no Klopp. It's really. I mean, we've toned this down the last couple of years because the manager we have now, Edin Terzic, he's really well beloved. Everybody likes him. And it's also that we've come to realize over the years that it's no good to always, compare everything to how it was under Klopp. But most people can't really help them, Having just said that we've realized all this, I went to the Eindhoven game with my son. And I was on the terrace and he was sitting down, and we met after the game. And he kind of said, well, the first 20 minutes were like under Klopp again, finally, because there was this power football and this passion. So it was, in a way, it's, it's still before Klopp and after Klopp for us.
That's fair enough. I wonder if I can sneak in a little contemporary question that's adjacent to the stadium, because it just sort of fascinates me what's happening with Leverkusen this season, and obviously the dominance that Bayern have had over the Bundesliga for the recent years, and you being their primary challenger. Does it feel good to see Bayern potentially being knocked off their perch, or are you a little bit annoyed that it's not you and it's one of your neighbours that might be doing it?
No, it's rather that it's Leverkusen. They're not. I mean, they're not the most popular team in Germany. It's not. I mean, it seems it's really silly to go on about this. They've been in the Bundesliga since the mid-70s, But to a lot of fans, they're a bit still like Wolfsburg, or but it's okay. I don't begrudge. I'm happy for them. I'm happy for the league, of course, and we had our chance. We should have taken it last year. And there was actually another year when we should have done it a couple of years ago. So it's good for the league, and looking at it now, they're probably going to win more than just the league, Leverkusen. But let's wait and see.
It is the 50th anniversary of the stadium this year. It's going to be one of the featured stadiums in Euro 2024. It's a stadium where the German national team has had a lot of success. Only ever lost one game. Very, very painful game. In fact, then please tell us about that semi-final from 2006, because that's the only time that Germany have lost in Dortmund.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that Dortmund's become the good luck ground. I remember when there was a time when they moved almost every really important fixture to Dortmund, thinking we're not going to lose there, because when I was younger, I'm sorry to go on about this, but when I was younger, there was always people in Dortmund always a bit of an ambivalent feeling about the national team. Myself included. When you look back in the 70s and 80s, the atmosphere when the national team was playing was always a bit divided between, people would suddenly start chants about Dortmund during the game, or it's because the club has always been more important than the country in Dortmund. It's always, and so I went to the game. Well, not as a neutral. That would be taking things too far. But I wasn't a big fan of it. I didn't go there as a fan of the national team. And 2 rows in front of me were 5 Italians. They were sitting, 2 rows in front of me were 5 or 6 people sitting there in Italian shirts. And we were watching the game. And of course, it was a very close game. It was actually a very, very good game. What I remember most vividly is that the Italian, the closer it got to the penalty shootout, the more panicky the Italians became. It started to bring on striker after striker, It was very un-Italian, but they were thinking that, probably thinking that we have no chance in a penalty shootout against Germans, so we got to win this. And that was really one of those cases where the ground falls almost completely quiet, when this ball went in. And the moment after the final whistle, I tapped one of the Italians on the shoulder, and he went like this, protecting his head, thinking I was going to hit him. But it was just, I would just want to shake his hand and say it was a good game and congratulations and good luck for the final.
Yeah, it's such a. I watched the highlights of that back before speaking to you, and it was such a. Even then, I felt it's 18 years later, and I felt tense for you watching, and it was so. It's not an easy Italian team to love either. That Italian team, and there was something about the way that you'd hosted that World Cup that which I think loads of people really enjoyed, and I think people are going to enjoy Euro 2024 again. That just.
Having said, even for me, this was probably the first German team it was easy to like. Sorry, I'm no different than from anybody else. Those teams of the 80s were, I couldn't relate to those players. The Schumacher incident in '82, and but this was really, it was a young team. Klinsmann had really worked wonders. Nobody was expecting anything of this team. It was also that Germany, but that happened a couple of years earlier, suddenly became a more multicultural team. They'd never been that in my during my early decades as a football fan. So, it was a good World Cup. It was a great World Cup. It was, we were good hosts.
I do want to let you go, I want to thank you for all your sort of memories of the stadium and explaining its sort of importance to the fans and its changing relationship. Well, I suppose the relationship you've had with the team over that time. Before I do let you go, though, are there any particularly strong memories or any favourite games or anything about the stadium or memories of the stadium that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, memorable games, of course. Again, it may seem, for modern Dortmund fans, probably not something that seems so important or so crucial. But you mentioned the 1980s and how often we were in a relegation fight. And Dortmund actually came within seconds of getting relegated. In 1986, they were in a promotion relegation game against Fortuna Cologne. And this was the away goals rule was, for whatever reason, was not used for those playoffs. So they lost the first game 2-0 in Cologne against Fortuna Cologne, not the other club. And then we fell behind 1-0 at home. So it was suddenly 3-0 against us. And we had one half of football left. And during that one half, a lot of people thought about, because the club really didn't have any money at that time. We wouldn't have been able to hold on to most of the players. And I think a lot of people had a lot of time during that second half to reflect on, what's going to happen now with the club. And we scored 3 goals in the second half, and the last came with the final attack of the game. Jeez, my voice is breaking already. Because it was such for anybody of my generation, and even for the generation after this was the most crucial game in the club's history. So they score a goal with the final attack of the game to force a third game as at a neutral ground. But this goal in the last minute, scored in front of the South Stand. I put this in my book because that's how I remember it. There were tons of people around me who never saw that goal because they were sitting on the stairs. They had the flags over their heads. And for this book, I phoned Lars Ricken, who I knew was a Dortmund. Well, he's a Dortmund boy. He was born in Dortmund. He's a Dortmund fan. And he was very small. And he was, let me think, 8? Anyway, he was a kid. And I wanted to have his recollections of the game. And the first thing that he said was he said, well, I was there. And it never occurred to me that it could have been at the game. But then I thought, 8, 9 years old, Dortmund kid. Okay, might have been. And then he said, I was standing behind the goal, exactly behind the goal where we scored that goal. And he said for him as well, it was, the most important game, the most important goal we ever scored. And of course, 11 years later, he scores the goal that wins the Champions League, in Munich. And he said it might have never happened, Well, in all likelihood, it would have never happened if Dortmund hadn't won this game with the last gasp goal. So that's really, I mean, it's hard to get. You can't get any better than that.
I agree. I mean, there's hardcore Manchester City fans who were City fans before the money came in, and they will tell you about playing Gillingham in the 3rd division, and that's their favourite game because that meant they got out of the 3rd division.
Is this the penalty shootout?
The penalty shootout. Yeah. I apologise for my dog, by the way, because someone's. But it's those moments which are really precarious that which could go either way. Where I think that fans gravitate to and remember fondly. And thankfully for you guys, it worked out because, I very much enjoyed watching the Dortmund teams of the mid-90s. Very much enjoyed watching him lob Angelo Peruzzi. We probably wouldn't have had that memory without that last-minute goal. And so I'm pleased for that.
I have one more memory, which is also, I don't know why this is another moment I remember vividly from the ground. I'm not saying this because we're doing this podcast now, but maybe the most beloved member, even though there were Dortmund lads in the team, Stefan Klose, the goalkeeper, Michael Zorc, the captain, Lars Ricken, the goal scorer. The players we loved the most might have been Paul Lambert. Because his story was so, he was never, he should have never been on that team, but he was in the Champions League final. He set up a goal, and then he had to leave, and he left. Well, because his wife, forced him to. She was, well, unhappy is probably too strong a word, but she didn't really settle in Dortmund. She was homesick. She wanted to go back to Britain. And so she basically told him, I'm going back. Come with me or don't. And he said, okay, I'm coming. So, and he got out of the contract and he left the club. And I forgot who we were playing in the Champions League. It was not Steaua Bucharest anyway. But he said goodbye to the fans after a game in the Champions League. And it was one of the great moments at the ground, because nobody left. People were singing for 15 minutes on end as he was circling the ground, crying with a banner in his hand. And that's also a very fond memory I have. Paul Lambert, you'll never walk alone, is what they sang.
Yeah, in terms of, we didn't even talk about how you also adopted "You'll Never Walk Alone" as your own as well. Yeah. It's
not my most favorite song. For instance, these days, I don't know if it's you probably get the television feed that everybody gets, so they would show you the South Stand, and everybody's holding a scarf and singing "You'll Never Walk Alone." And if you look very closely, there's two people who never put up the scarves, and that's me and my son. Because we think it's a Liverpool song, We have our own song. I once went, I was on the Deutsche Welle. They have a television program that goes out into all kinds of countries. And I was on, his name was Desmond Squires, I think. And he was trying to rile me up or rip me or whatever. And he was saying, by the way, you should get your own club song. And I said, we have. And he said, no, you don't. I said, we have. And he said, no, you don't. And I said, we have. And he said, no, you're singing a Liverpool song. And I said, yes, but after that, we sing our song. Because when you listen closely, when the teams actually run out, that's when they play what we consider the clubs in them, Hey, BVB, a song. It's a silly song from the 70s. But we sing along to that one. But not to "You'll Never Walk Alone" is a thorny subject. For me. Just for me.
Absolutely fair enough. And I will look out for your two-person protest next time I'm watching the feed, perhaps during the Atletico game in the Champions League. I'm battling my dog, but it's interesting, the history of "You'll Never Walk Alone." In 1996, at the Euro 96 semi-final between England and Germany, England fans sing "You'll Never Walk Alone" before the game. It used to be more universal. It didn't used to just be associated with Liverpool, but that process, Celtic used to sing it, many other clubs used to sing it, but it has become the Liverpool anthem. And now you couldn't imagine "You'll Never Walk Alone" being played before an England game, because Manchester United fans won't want to sing it, Chelsea fans won't want to sing it, etc., etc. But if you go back, 30 odd years, almost 30 years ago, all England fans are happy to sing it before the semi-final again in Euro 96, which is interesting.
Yeah. I didn't know that. I thought it was universal only in Germany, because we imported it as a football song in the 90s, and it was sung at many grounds. Leverkusen fan, a Leverkusen fan I once interviewed, he was totally shocked. Because, what was it, did they reach the Champions League final in the early 90s, and they played Manchester in the semis, quarters? I can't remember.
2002.
But they were very proud of themselves for their, very good rendition of "You'll Never Walk Alone" before the game. And then they said that they were booed by the entire ground at Old Trafford. That was when they realized, hang on for a moment. This is a Liverpool song and they're Manchester's rivals. So they think no, that was not our intention. We were just singing a football song.
Yeah, well, it's It does have a fascinating history. Uli, thank you very much for your time and your memories of the ground. I wish you a happy 50th anniversary of the stadium, and hope you can enjoy it for many years to come still. And all the best for the remainder of this season, particularly in Europe and for the Euros as well.
Thank you. It's fine.
Thank you, Uli, and that was it was fascinating, and it was educational for me, and most importantly, it was entertaining. He was really, really, really good value. I enjoyed that a lot, and yeah, hopefully you guys did too. Now, Dortmund is a great ground, and they've got the Champions League second leg, quarterfinal second leg coming up this week against Atletico, delicately poised, 2-1 from the first leg, and we'll see what happens there. And it's strange because I think both Atletico and Dortmund are clubs, sort of, even though they're both mega clubs in their own right and in their own leagues on a European stage, they've always felt a sort of a late European stage. They always feel a little bit underdoggy, and a sort of a team that you can support. And they've obviously had very prominent managers that have inspired that support. Klopp with Dortmund and Simeone with Atletico. So let's see where it goes with there. But good that one of those is going to be in the Champions League semi-finals. That's me waffling. I'm stopping. Next week, I think we're going to go tennis. I think so. We're either going to go tennis or football. I think we'll do an admin on the show now. We'll go tennis, and we're going to hear from the broadcaster Kate Mason. Kate is really good value. So I don't know if you know her from the Football Ramble or Fighting Talk, or most recently she was doing TNT's cricket coverage. She's really, really fun. The chat about Wimbledon, Centre Court Wimbledon, is great, and it's enhanced by the fact that she joined us in the middle of perhaps one of the epic hangovers, because she joined us very early in the morning after being at the Sports Journalism Awards the night before. It's already recorded. It is a brilliant, fun episode. So hopefully you'll join us next week for me, Kate Mason, Wimbledon Centre Court, and an all-time hangover. Until then.